as Emma Sullivan rearranged the pile of books in her arms. The fresh fall air brought a subtle pine aroma. The majority of teachers had already left the building an hour ago. But Emma frequently stayed late cleaning her classroom or going over her students' progress. Today was no different, save for the persistent concern that had been building all week. Her second-grade student Sophie Miller had been having more difficulties than usual. Sophie used to be a bright and vivacious child, but now she appeared withdrawn. Emma had seen the girl's tear-streaked face more than once, and her homework was often left undone. While difficulties were common among students, Emma's intuition told her that this was something more serious. As the sun began to set, illuminating the horizon in shades of pink and orange, Emma decided it was time to talk to Sophie's father. Having sent a note home earlier in the week asking for a meeting and receiving no response, she decided to wait a little longer, hoping that today would be the day he arrived. Just as Emma was about to leave, she heard hurried footsteps echoing down the deserted hallway. She turned to see a man carrying a briefcase in one hand and a folder in the other. His tie tattered and his jacket wrinkled as if he had thrown it on in a hurry. His dark hair framed a face etched with worry and exhaustion, and his expression was apologetic. "I'm so sorry I'm late," he said, a little out of breath. "I had a last-minute meeting at work." Emma gave him a comforting smile, but she couldn't help but notice the dark circles under his eyes. "No problem, Mr. Miller. I appreciate you coming," she said. He put his belongings down and held out his hand. "Please call me Michael," he corrected. "All right, Michael," Emma answered, shaking his hand. "His touch was warm despite the cold air," he remarked. "Should we sit?" They went to a small table in the classroom corner after Michael nodded. Sophie's desk was close by, and there were some drawings of flowers and animals on it, but they looked hurried in comparison to her previous work. "Thank you for meeting with me," Emma said gently. "I wanted to talk about Sophie. She's been having a bit of a tough time lately." Michael sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "I know," he said. Emma nodded. "She's been through a lot this past year. My wife passed away last year," Michael remarked in a tight automobile accident, urging him to keep going. "Since then, it's just been Sophie and myself. I thought I was doing well, but now it seems like I'm failing her." Emma was surprised by the unadulterated emotion in his voice. "Grief is difficult, especially for children, but it sounds like you're trying your hardest." Michael gave a small smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. She had previously worked with bereaved families, but something about Michael's vulnerability resonated deeply with her. "You're not failing her," Emma said gently. "Between work and everything else, I'm trying." Emma paused to collect her thoughts before answering. "Sophie has been quieter than usual in class. I feel like I'm always one step behind." She claimed to be preoccupied and to have fallen behind on her assignments. Yet she still participates in group activities, and I can tell she's making an effort. Michael's face flickered with remorse as he glanced down at his hands. "I will speak with her," he responded. "Things have been hectic, so perhaps I haven't been listening carefully enough." Emma paused before continuing. "If it's okay with you, Michael, do you have any support?" Michael, family friend, shook his head, saying that it's primarily just me because my wife's family is difficult and my folks are out of state. The despondency in his voice made Emma's heart hurt. "That's a lot for one person to handle," she murmured. "Please let me know if I can be of any assistance." Michael looked up and briefly met her gaze, perhaps examining her to see whether or not her offer was sincere. "Thank you," he replied softly. "I'll remember that." As their talk progressed and the initial uneasiness between them started to fade, Michael talked candidly about the difficulties of being a single father, including Sophie's nightmares and the strain of juggling her emotional demands with her employment obligations. Emma paid close attention, making brief recommendations and encouraging remarks. At one point, Michael stated in a lighter tone, "You must be a great teacher. Sophie always talks about you." Emma's cheeks flushed. "She's a great kid," she added. "Smart, creative, Kind, you've done a good job raising her. Michael laughed quietly. Thank you, but I'm not sure about it. Emma suggested that we have some after-school activities that Sophie might enjoy, like art classes and music. These could give her an outlet and help her feel more connected. Emma noticed a warmth in his eyes now, a flicker of something that hadn't been there before. Emma felt a strange sense of ease around him, as though they had known each other for much longer than the 30 minutes they had spent together before leaving. Michael gave a contemplative nod. That sounds fantastic. Tonight, I will discuss it with her. As they rose up and said their goodbyes, Emma led him to the door. With his palm resting on the door frame, Michael paused before saying, "Thank you, Emma." His voice was sincere. "It means more than you know that you care about Sophie." Emma grinned. Emma couldn't help but feel that this meeting was the start of something important as he left with his briefcase swinging by his side. She simply had no idea how complicated things would get. The following week, Sophie started taking art classes after school, and Emma saw a change in Sophie's demeanor right away. Although she was still shy, the girl seemed more at ease. Her focus in class improved, and she even smiled a few times, which warmed Emma's heart. Michael frequently arrived early to pick up Sophie, taking advantage of the additional time to talk to Emma. Their exchanges began light-heartedly with jokes about the difficulties of parenting or with updates on Sophie's development, but they soon became more intimate. One rainy Thursday evening, Michael arrived earlier than usual, soaked from head to toe, and looked sheepish as he stood in the school's doorway with water dripping from his jacket. Emma teased him, "You look like you've had better days," and handed him a towel from the school's supply closet. Michael laughed, making a sound that felt warmer than the towel. But you had no idea that he lingered after Sophie's art class ended, offering to help Emma clean the classroom as they arranged desks and picked up stray crayons. Their conversation unexpectedly became personal. Michael said softly, "Do you ever feel like you're just failing at everything?" Emma hesitated and said, "I've learned to forgive myself for not being perfect, but I'm always caught off guard by the rawness of the question." "Nobody is. You make it seem so easy," Michael said, nodding with a little smile tugging at his lips. "It helps," Emma responded, "but it's not. To have people who understand." The following week, Emma and Michael's paths crossed outside of school when Emma stopped by a nearby cafe to grade papers and noticed Michael staring blankly at his laptop at a corner table. His tie was loose, and his face had the same tired expression she had seen when they first met. Emma hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to approach him, but he looked up and saw her. A small smile and a flash of recognition appeared on his face, and he said, "Fancy seeing you here." Emma pointed to the vacant seat on the other side. "Would you mind if I joined you?" "Absolutely not." As if driven by the quiet intimacy of the moment, Michael started talking after they had sat in friendly silence for a few minutes drinking coffee. "Some days I feel like I'm drowning," he admitted. "The bill, the work, trying to be there for Sophie. It's like no matter how hard I try, I can't keep up." Emma put a comforting hand over the table and said, "You're doing the best you can, Michael. That's all Sophie needs." He looked down at her hand, then back up at her. His eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and something else, something unspoken. He said softly, "You don't know how much that means." As their connection deepened, Emma found herself looking forward to her conversations with Michael. He had a way of making her laugh even on the toughest days, and she admired his resilience despite everything he was going through. One evening after Sophie's art class, Michael lingered longer than usual. The school's lights cast a soft glow on the hallway as they stood by the door. Their words laced with unspoken emotions. "You've been amazing with Sophie," Michael said, his voice earnest. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you." "You don't need to," Emma replied. "I'm just glad to see her smiling again." He hesitated as if searching for the right words. "You're an incredible person, Emma. Sophie and I, we're lucky to have you." Heard her heart skip a beat at the "it" in his tone. "You're pretty incredible yourself," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. For a moment it felt as though the world had narrowed to just the two of them. But then Sophie's voice broke the spell. calling for her father from down the hall. Michael smiled apologetically and turned to leave, but not before glancing back at Emma. "Good night," he said softly. "Good night," she replied, her voice tinged with a mixture of warmth and longing. Despite the growing bond between them, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that Michael was holding something back. There were moments when his laughter seemed forced or when his eyes clouded with worry. Sophie, to occasionally let slip small details that hinted at a more complicated home life, mentions of strange men visiting or her father working late into the night. Emma told herself it wasn't her place to pry. But the more time she spent with Michael, the more she found herself wanting to understand the weight he carried and to help him bear it. As the weeks passed, Emma noticed a change in Michael. Though he still made time for their after-school chats, he seemed distracted. His phone buzzed constantly, and he would often glance at it with a furrowed brow before silencing the screen. Sophie's demeanor also shifted. She began to show signs of anxiety, jumping at loud noises and clinging to Emma during class. One evening after Sophie's art class, Emma approached Michael as he waited by the school entrance. "Is everything okay?" she asked gently. "You've seemed preoccupied." Michael hesitated, his hand tightening around the strap of his briefcase. "It's just work," he said quickly. "Things have been hectic." Emma nodded. Though his response didn't fully convince her, she decided not to press further. But a seed of doubt had been planted. Something wasn't adding up. A few days later, Emma overheard Sophie talking to another student during recess. The words stopped her in her tracks. "My dad says we might have to move again," Sophie said, her voice tinged with sadness. "I don't want to, though. I like it here." Emma felt her stomach drop. Moving hadn't mentioned anything about that? Why would he uproot Sophie now? Just as she was starting to settle that evening, Emma stayed late to prepare for a parent-teacher meeting. As she was leaving the school, she spotted Michael in the parking lot, leaning against his car. He wasn't alone. A man in a dark suit stood in front of him, speaking in low, clipped tones. Even from a distance, Emma could see the tension in Michael's posture, the way his shoulders were hunched, his fists clenched at his sides. Emma ducked behind a pillar, her heart racing. She couldn't hear their conversation, but the interaction didn't look friendly. The man handed Michael a piece of paper, then walked away, leaving Michael standing there, staring at the document with a look of defeat. The next day, Emma found Michael waiting for her outside her classroom. He looked tired, his usual composed demeanor replaced by something closer to desperation. "Can we talk?" he asked. Emma nodded, leading him to an empty conference room. Once they were seated, Michael took a deep breath and began to speak. "I owe you an explanation," he said, his voice strained. "You've done so much for Sophie and me. I haven't been completely honest with you." Emma's chest tightened. "Go on." Michael hesitated, running a hand through his hair. "When my wife passed, she left behind debts. A lot of them I didn't know about until after the accident. But she had been borrowing money to cover gambling losses." Emma's eyes widened. "Gambling?" He nodded. "At first I thought I could handle it. I sold everything I could, our house, most of our belongings. But it wasn't enough. The people she owed weren't exactly patient." A chill ran down Emma's spine. "Are you saying those men I saw were loan sharks?" Michael admitted, his voice heavy with shame. "They've been following me, threatening me. That's why I've been thinking about moving. I need to keep Sophie safe." Emma leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. She had suspected something was wrong, but this was more than she had anticipated. "Michael, why didn't you tell me sooner?" she asked, her tone a mix of frustration and concern. "I didn't want to drag you into it," he said. "You've already done so much for Sophie. This is my problem, not yours. But Sophie is my student," Emma replied, "and I care about her, care about you too, Michael." His eyes softened at her words, but the weight of his situation remained. "I don't know what to do," he admitted. "Every time I think I'm making progress, they come back demanding more. It feels like a never-ending cycle." Emma reached across the table, placing a hand on his. "We'll figure this out," she said firmly. "You're not alone in this." Despite her words, Emma couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease. That night, she lay awake in bed, replaying their conversation in her mind. She trusted Michael, but his situation was dangerous. Was she making a mistake by getting involved? The following day, Sophie arrived at school with dark circles under her eyes during lunch. She clung to Emma, her small hands gripping her teacher's arm. "Is everything okay at home?" Emma asked gently. Sophie hesitated, then nodded. But her eyes told a different story filled with a sadness that seemed far too heavy for a child. As Emma watched Sophie return to her seat, she felt a surge of determination she couldn't stand by while this little girl's life was overshadowed by fear and uncertainty. She had to do something, anything, to help that evening. Emma called a lawyer friend explaining Michael's situation without revealing too many personal details. The friend offered to look into the legality of the debts and see if there were any options for addressing the loan shark threats. Emma also began researching community resources, hoping to find additional support for Michael and Sophie. But as she delved deeper, she realized just how precarious their situation was. The stakes were higher than she had imagined, and the path forward was anything but clear. For it was well past midnight when Emma's phone buzzed on her nightstand. Groggy and disoriented, she reached for it. The bright screen illuminating Michael's, a sense of dread settled over her as she answered Michael. She said, her voice laced with concern on the other end. His voice trembled. "I need your help," he said. "They're here." Emma sat up, her heart pounding. "Where are you at?" "My apartment," he replied. His words rushed. "Sophie's with a neighbor. I didn't know who else to call." Emma didn't hesitate. "I'm on my way," throwing on a coat. She grabbed her car keys and raced out the door. The streets were eerily quiet as she sped toward Michael's apartment, her mind racing with worst-case scenarios. She couldn't shake the image of Sophie's frightened eyes or the fear in Michael's voice when Emma arrived. She found Michael standing outside his apartment, flanked by two men. One was tall and lean, his sharp features twisted into a sneer, while the other was broad-shouldered with a permanent scowl. Both exuded an air of menace. "Who's this?" the taller man asked, eyeing Emma with suspicion. "A friend," Michael said quickly. "She has nothing to do with this." Emma stepped forward, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "Whatever this is, it needs to stop. You're scaring his daughter." The broad-shouldered man chuckled darkly. "This isn't a PTA meeting, my lady. I stay out of it." Emma's fear was palpable, but her resolve was stronger. "You've made your point," she said, her voice steady now. "Leave before I call the police." The men exchanged a glance before the taller one spoke. "You've got until the end of the week, Miller. No more extensions." With that, they walked away, their footsteps echoing down the empty street. Emma let out a shaky breath and turned to Michael, who looked as though the weight of the world had crushed him inside the apartment. Michael slumped onto the couch, his head in his hands. Emma sat beside him, her heart aching at the sight of him so defeated. "I can't keep doing this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're not going to stop." Emma placed a hand on his shoulder. "There has to be a way out of this, Michael. We'll figure it out." He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and despair. "You don't understand. It's not just the debt. There's more." Emma's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Michael hesitated, then exhaled sharply. "The accident that killed my wife. It wasn't just bad luck. She was driving home from a casino she'd been drinking." The revelation hit Emma like a blow. She struggled to process the weight of his words. "She called me that night," Michael continued, his voice trembling. "She begged me to come get her. But I was so angry I told her to figure it out herself. I thought she'd call a cab. I didn't think." His voice broke, and Emma felt tears prick her eyes. "Michael, it wasn't your fault," she said softly. "But it feels like it," he replied, his expression haunted. "If I had just gone to get her, maybe she'd still be here. Maybe Sophie wouldn't have to go through all this." The weight of Michael's confession stayed with Emma long after she left his apartment. As she lay awake in bed, she replayed his words in her mind, grappling with the depth of his guilt and the dangerous reality he faced. She wanted to help him, but how the loan sharks weren't going to back down, and Michael's financial situation seemed insurmountable. For the first time, Emma questioned whether her involvement was truly making a difference or if she was simply delaying the inevitable. Yet as doubt crept in, so did determination. She thought of Sophie, bright, sweet Sophie, who deserved a chance at a better life if Emma didn't fight for her. Who would the next day Emma meet with her lawyer friend Laura, who had been researching the loan shark's activities. The good news, Laura said, is that these guys aren't exactly operating legally. If Michael goes to the authorities, he might have a case. And the bad news? Emma asked, bracing herself. Is that going to the authorities come with risks? Laura admitted these guys don't play fair. If they feel threatened, they could escalate. Emma felt a pang of fear but pushed it aside. What about the debts? Is there any way to settle them? Laura hesitated. Not without a lot of money. Emma left the meeting feeling both hopeful and overwhelmed. She shared the information with Michael that evening, but his reaction was less optimistic. I can't put Sophie at risk, he said firmly. If they think I'm going to the police, who knows what they'll do. But you can't keep living like this. Emma argued. You deserve better. Sophie deserves better. Michael looked at her. His expression conflicted. I know. I don't know what to do. Determined to help, Emma decided to organize a community benefit. She enlisted the help of her fellow teachers' parents and local business owners, framing it as an effort to support a struggling family. Though she didn't share the full extent of Michael's situation, her passion and sincerity inspired others to get involved as word spread. Donations poured in, and the school gymnasium was transformed into a bustling event space filled with raffle prizes, bake sale tables, and live music. Emma worked tirelessly, driven by the hope that this effort could provide Michael and Sophie with the fresh start they desperately needed. On the night of the benefit, Michael arrived with Sophie, and the little girl's eyes lit up at the sight of the decorated gym. And for the first time in weeks, Emma saw her smile. But as the event unfolded, Emma's relief was short-lived. The loan sharks arrived, their presence casting a dark shadow over the evening. They cornered Michael near the refreshments table, their voices low but threatening. Emma intervened, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. You need to leave, she said, drawing the attention of nearby parents and teachers. The taller man sneered. This isn't over. Miller, as they left, turned to Emma, his expression a mix of gratitude and shame. I don't know how to thank you, he said quietly. You don't have to, Emma replied. We're in this together. The benefit had been a bittersweet success, for the community had rallied together, raising enough funds to make a significant dent in Michael's debt. Yet the tension from the loan shark's presence lingered, casting a shadow over the night's accomplishments. Emma woke early the next morning, the event replaying in her mind. She couldn't ignore the growing sense of urgency. The loan sharks weren't going to back down quietly, and Michael's safety and Sophie's future hung in the balance. Her phone buzzed with a text from Michael. Thank you for last night. I owe you more than I can ever repay. Emma smiled faintly, her resolve hardening. This isn't over yet. Emma called Michael, asking him to meet her at a nearby park. Sophie stayed with a neighbor, giving them the privacy they needed to speak openly as they sat on a bench beneath the shade of a sprawling oak tree. Emma laid out her plan. You need to go to the authorities, she said, her tone firm. Laura found enough evidence to make a case against these men. They're operating illegally. Michael, if we expose them, they'll have no choice but to back off. Michael shook his head, his jaw tightening. And if they retaliate, I can't take that risk. Emma, not with Sophie. Emma placed a hand on his arm. What's the alternative? You keep paying them until there's nothing left. You've already sold everything you can. You're running out of options. Michael exhaled sharply, his gaze fixed on the ground. I just want her to be safe. She will be, Emma said softly. But you have to trust me. Trust yourself. You've come this far, Michael. Don't let them take any more from you. That evening, with Emma by his side, Michael met with Laura and a local detective who had taken an interest in the case. Together they reviewed the evidence, recorded threats, financial documents, and witness statements from other victims of the loan sharks. The detective assured Michael that they would handle the situation discreetly, minimizing the risk to him and Sophie. It wasn't an easy decision, but Michael agreed to cooperate. The detective outlined the next steps, promising swift action to dismantle the loan sharks' operation. As they left the station, Michael turned to Emma. I don't know how you do it, he said, his voice heavy with emotion. Every time I wanted to give up, you kept pushing me forward. Emma smiled, her eyes bright with determination. Because you're worth it, Michael. And so is Sophie. Despite the progress they had made, the days that followed were tense. Michael stayed home from work, keeping Sophie close while the authorities prepared their case. Emma visited, often bringing meals and helping Sophie with her schoolwork. One afternoon, as Emma arrived at Michael's apartment, she noticed a car parked across the street. Two men sat inside, their eyes trained on the building. A chill ran down her spine, but she forced herself to remain calm inside. She told Michael what she had seen. His expression darkened, but he refused to let fear dictate his actions. "They were trying to intimidate us," he said, "but I won't let them win." Emma admired his resolve, but she couldn't shake her own anxiety. She stayed with them late into the evening, her presence a comfort to both Michael and Sophie. A week later, the police raided the Loan Sharks operation, arresting several key players and seizing evidence of their illegal activities. The news brought a wave of relief, but the emotional toll of the ordeal was still evident. Michael met Emma at the park where they had first discussed going to the authorities. He looked lighter somehow, as though a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "It's over," he said, a faint smile playing at his lips were free. Emma felt tears prick her eyes. "You did it," she said. "You fought for Sophie, for yourself. I'm so proud of you." Michael reached for her hand, his touch warm and steady. "I couldn't have done it without you, Emma. You believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself." They stood in silence for a moment, the world around them fading into the background. Then, with a quiet determination, Michael pulled Emma into a gentle embrace. In the weeks that followed, Michael and Sophie began rebuilding their lives. The funds from the benefit allowed them to move to a new apartment in a safer neighborhood. And Michael started a new job with the help of a friend from the community. Emma remained a constant presence in their lives, her bond with Sophie growing stronger with each passing day. As for her relationship with Michael, it deepened in ways that neither of them had anticipated. What had started as a shared struggle became the foundation for something beautiful. Partnership built on trust, resilience, and love. One evening, as they sat together in Emma's cozy living room, Sophie asleep on the couch beside them, Michael turned to Emma. "You've changed my life," he said softly. "In more ways than I can count." Emma smiled, her heart full. "You changed mine too." And in that quiet moment, with the past behind them and the future full of promise, they knew they had found something worth fighting for, something they would never let go.